Welcome to the show Brain Rot, What Our Screens Are Doing to Our Minds, a special series from the New Books Network. Here are your hosts, Dr. Karyne Messina and Dr. Harry Gill.
Hello, this is Dr. Karyne Messina. Thank you for joining our show. Today we're going to be talking about the problems of too much screen time in adulthood. Our podcast is called Brain Rot, What Our Screens Are Doing to Our Minds. I'm, as I said, Dr. Karyne Messina, psychologist, psychoanalyst, and an author, and also a New Books Network host. I'll be discussing this topic with Dr. Harry Gill, a well-known psychiatrist who also has a PhD in neuroscience. So, Dr. Gill, from a neuroscience perspective, why don't you tell our audience things that happen or go awry when adults, maybe we'll start with young adults, and this would be during Erik Erikson's identity versus, or actually it's intimacy versus isolation phase. So it's young adults. What happens if they watch or they are exposed to too much screen time?
This period of development, the brain, or particularly the frontal lobe, is still wiring. I think the most recent reliable research on the wiring of the brain suggests that the prefrontal cortex continues to wire until we're 25 years of age, meaning that in that early development, that part of the brain that makes all the decisions and assesses the reality as we see it, as we know it, is still developing. Also, it's the critical area, critical time in anybody's life in developing a sense of identity, as you mentioned, and the questions of who am I, who do I want to be with, who is going to be my partner, how do I communicate with the world in this newfound adult state. So the person is leaving their family, they're going out of the separation individuation stage, they're now individual, but they have to figure out how to connect with the rest of the world. And under normal or normative millennia of our brain development circumstances, we would rely on our interactions with our social group in real life to discover through the process of mirroring, mirror neurons, how people respond to us, how do we respond to them, how do we manage aggression in the context of the group, how do we manage intimacy in the context of the group, and the bonding would slowly but surely occur. As baseline, human beings tend to be socially anxious, and in silence they tend to be paranoid. We're always leaning towards social isolation. So we're much more prone to lean into isolation versus intimacy in the balance of those two forces. And from that perspective, screens, as I see it in my clinical practice day to day, are increasingly offering a refuge, and they're supporting the defensive stance of people and escape into a screen, into quasi-intimacy, leads people into a very comfortable place in which, on one hand, they believe they have attained intimacy, but in fact, they have attained isolation. So when the screen eventually goes off at the end of the night, the mood sinks, the dark thoughts come, and then the screens may come on, and engagement with quasi-intimacy continues until the person is completely exhausted, and therefore the next day they can't go to classes, they can't meet with their friends. So many, many more, I would say, youngsters that are imparting on the college experience are beginning to implode because they can't really manage actual intimacy. The other, probably pernicious, I'm going to be judgmental for a moment, influence on the development of the young mind is the emergence of dating apps, where in the past people had to go to a social gathering place, engage in conversations, learn how to approach somebody, learn how to deal with rejection, learn how to deal with being left or abandoned in the moment in real time. with apps, while it's all very, very convenient, it is also prone to being very unreal. So that the person creates, and you will tell us more about this, will create a fantasy of who the other person is through the process of projective identification. And vice versa, we can project who we think we are very intensely, so that endless hours can be spent chatting with a person that you may never meet, or if you meet, it's a person that is completely really not the person you expected to see, which leads us back into isolation. And from the neuroscience perspective, all of these functions of aggression, tolerating aggression, being able to initiate aggression, expressing sexual desire, engaging in sexual contact, dealing with sexual rejection, those are all functions that really have to be developed in much the same way as a writing skill, language skill, reading skill. It's simply, from brain materialistic position, it's a function of the brain that needs exercise. And with the screen interfering, there isn't enough exercise.
Yes, as much as I like Erickson's 8 stages of development, I think that it's really important to keep in mind that intimacy, it's a stage of fundamentally young adulthood, but it's also, so intimacy and identity to me blend together because they're important in adolescence, and they're also important in young adulthood and with middle-aged people and with older people. Sometimes people don't form an identity until later on if they kind of get hooked into the right thing for them, whether it's could be yoga, often it's therapy, could be meditation, but they can kind of find out who they are later. But typically, it's the task of adolescence to find out who one is. But I think social media has changed things. So what you're saying about projective identification, which means you project something either about yourself that you don't like, or you can also project as if you're projecting on a big screen an idea of someone else. So you create this image of who you think someone is, and it may have nothing to do with reality at all. And social media really allows a person, invites a person to do that. So you have whoever, wherever you're meeting this person, it can just be an Instagram. You don't have to, it doesn't have to be an dating app where you might actually end up having a conversation, maybe if you're lucky. But it's just the image that you create of this person having not a lot to do with reality. It's also something I said last time, when you have like 500 or 1,000 or 10,000 friends, but you actually may be quite isolated, and you might have very few friends, maybe no friends at all. But you create this idea that you have all of these friends, but it's just a fantasy. So that's the projection is a very important thing to keep in mind. A lot of things can go awry with too much screen time. I guess people think they have a lot of friends if they're doing gaming or if they're doing any kind of video game with other people. They think those people are friends. If they're friends from school or college or work and they happen to be playing a game with them on some kind of device, that's one thing. But just meeting people and exchanging whatever kind of information on a screen, that's not really connecting with people.
And in fact, to amplify what you're saying, the interference of screen and intimacy is very profound. In clinical examples, I work with a lot of young couples that have just started having a relationship. And the struggle for them is to engage in something as simple as sharing a screen experience, because one is playing a computer game on one computer, the other one is reading news on their screen or playing another computer game. And they simply don't know how to collaborate on planning a dinner or planning what their living arrangements are going to be. Intimacy beyond establishing a couple, the intimacy within a couple or intimacy within a friendship. the phenomena that everybody talks about, to see several young adults having dinner together, and each one of them is staring at a screen, but not actually sharing mutual experiences, is a real impact on brain development of ability to communicate, share opinions, and consequences, both personal from the brain development perspective and societal, as we're experiencing, that these past several years are very, very dramatic. When people don't communicate, don't share opinions, live within their own particular box on the screen, they're really isolated.
Yeah.
Everybody has an opinion that can be heard. Everybody has an opinion that can be discussed. And in sharing opinions or thoughts in an intimate way, we're beginning to give some richness to the reality versus the two-dimensional reality that most people experience through the screen time.
I have a patient who's very interested in the idea of creating, it's sort of a group house idea, but it's with intent, not just because you might not have money, so you hang out in a house with people, but it's creating community space together. And one of the things he talks about is having rules so that you spend X amount of time, maybe it's a dinner a couple of times a week, but with no screens. It's not this deal of everybody sitting there with their screen, having dinner, maybe participating in conversation, but watching their screen. So whether it's a family who sets limits with parents saying, okay, no screens at X number of time, during these times we're having no screens, or whether it's in a community, or if it could be people in nursing homes, if somebody can set some sort of limit of, we're going to do these activities and whatever else you do. With adults, it's kind of hard to say that, but it's hard to tell them what they're going to do. But if you get like-minded people and to convince them that it's really detrimental, and it's much better, and people would rather participate in activities, I think. Often people get into being solo screen viewers because they don't have anybody around. So that's where isolation comes in, obviously, and that can be at any age.
To add to that concept of isolation in communication or experience of the world, the other is really required. The other brain, looking at an object, creates a three-dimensional view of an object, and in this case, an idea. Just like two eyes are necessary to create a sense of depth and perspective. So between our two eyes on the screen, reality is very flat. And having somebody else take a look at the election, what's currently going on with firing people, the state of economy, the world, which house should I buy? Human beings for millennia have reached new ideas, new developments in technology and intellectual achievement by sharing their ideas with others and enhancing and fine-tuning them. And the exchange of ideas in which everybody agrees with everybody else within the echo chamber is not the space where the brain will develop. It'll remain stagnant, and it will remain ultimately isolated.
I was really thrilled when I was talking to a patient today, because I had been reviewing Erickson's stages of development to prepare for this conversation that we're having. And I read several studies that indicated that people who spend more than 6 hours a day on screens are often quite depressed or quite anxious. And about that time, I had a little bit of a break today. About that time, I started talking to this man who, he has a community, but he also was on, and I really had no idea about this until today. He said he was talking about cutting out various social media platforms, and he's doing it because he doesn't like what's going on politically. It's a whole other idea of whether somebody should tune all of that out or not. That's another conversation for another podcast, but because there are pros and cons to that. But he's decided for his own well-being. He also happens to be a therapist, that he was going to go off, I'll say Instagram to start with. And then he decided he was going to stop something else. And this has been incrementally occurring. And today he said, well, he got off his last thing, Reddit. And then he said, I figured out I was spending 5 to 6 hours a day. He said, do you know, Dr. Messina, I now have 30 hours a week. He has other degrees, but he had a degree in music, and he used to play, I believe, the mandolin, guitar, and he also was an artist back in the day. And he said, my God, it was like an awakening for him. And he realized that he had 30 hours a week. I mean, that's a lot of time. So even if he used a third of that, half, a third, it's a lot of time to play music if that's something you love.
Well, clinically, I very much use time as a variable. When I work with adults, kids, whoever, I talk about the finite amount of time that we all have, and that it starts with big picture, the finite amount of time in a lifetime, and shrunk down to finite amount of time in a week, and then amount of time in a day. And then we talk about how much time did you spend on the screen. Usual conversation is around self-flagellation because they are procrastinating, they didn't study for the exam, or they didn't cook, so they spent too much money on DoorDash. And then introduction of the concept of time is it's a revelation for people. And the language I use, which may be a little graphic, is to say it's like taking your time behind the shed and shooting it in the head. That's what you're doing when you're spending 3 or 4 or 5 hours playing computer games. Those are also, from the developmental perspective, 3, 4, 5 hours that a person is not spending thinking about who they are, who they love, who they hate, what do they want to be when they grow up, what's the strategic plan to get there, and because all of those ideas require time. The screen, and as you say, the purpose of the screen is to take our attention. It's a battle. We need the screen needs us, and how do we strike a balance between our need for everything that has been put on the screen and cannot be obtained any longer versus the screen occupying our brain most of the day.
I have another couple who has worked on this idea of not being in front of screens during the evening hours. At a certain point, I don't know what it is exactly, but it's a cutoff time as they're preparing to go to bed. But I don't mean that they're going to sleep yet. They have a routine now of they spend time doing something together, but maybe reading books. So they're in bed and they spend time doing something non-screen related. And then they like their cuddle time. And then they go to sleep, but with no blue light in front of them at all. That's in the living room. That's not in the bedroom. I know you know a lot about blue lights and what happens to the brain when you just have it on until 11 o'clock, or you watch the 11 o'clock news and shut it off and try to go to sleep. I mean, obviously, I don't think melatonin is really produced. I think people have a lot of trouble, so they can pop pills.
The idea of falling asleep right after you have both been exposed to blue light and you have engaged in intellectual activity, the balancing act between acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter that keeps us awake and basically lights up the brain, and shutting that down, and introduction of melatonin to put us to sleep, it is not a light switch. And acetylcholine does not go off. There's time for brain to metabolize the neurotransmitter, meaning to take this molecule apart, and then we can slowly fall below the threshold where melatonin is adequate to put us to sleep. So yes, then we start popping pills because we need the switch, versus, as this couple is doing, it is absolutely not unreasonable to completely turn off the phone as a screen before you start making dinner. There is, as I like to tell people, unless you're a neurosurgeon on call at the Children's Hospital, it can all wait. There's literally no reason to rush to the screen. And shared experience of watching a movie together, watching news together, doing family stuff together promotes the intimacy, because it's that shared experience of we're all watching the same material and we have our own reactions to it and we can talk about it. And again, two brains looking at the same reality, creating new meaning, versus two brains in parallel mode, staring at different screens, living in their own reality. That's isolation, even if you're married. And you can have two kids and two parents, and they're all isolated. There's no intimacy if four people are experiencing world four different ways at the same time.
Yeah. So let's talk about mitigation of these problems. Now, we've talked about what parents could do to set limits for their children, but what can adults do to stop this behavior? Because it is like an addiction. I think it is considered an addiction, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And the anxiety that is generated successfully by the producers of content make us want to check it more. Yeah, the anxiety of what is President Trump doing this minute? So what's the Democratic response the next minute? Some clients check their news outlets every 5-10 minutes to see what's happening. When in fact, if you really study the news cycle, we all know it's 3 or 4 news items on repeat through most of the day. So what we can do is use the tools that increasingly do exist on the screens, which is to automatically have the phone go into do not disturb mode at some point in time in the day. 8 p.m. is sort of my rule of thumb. After that, I don't need to know anything beyond that point. Really, really focus on notifications, turning off notifications for social media in particular. There is nothing that cannot wait for a sliver of time that you want to spend. And it's funny you mentioned Instagram. I had Instagram account for 5 minutes because all the advertising for events now happens through Instagram. So Metropolitan Museum in New York or Neue Gallery in New York, you have no idea what goes on there unless you have an Instagram account. But then you're a victim of pings and pongs. And one of the fun stories I like to tell my clients about how good the advertising is. One day when I opened Instagram account, I ended up buying 3 pairs of pants that I absolutely didn't need, but they looked so interesting and so compelling that $300 later, I had 3 pairs. One of them was actually okay. 2 had to go back. But the compelling nature of people that are experts in engagement, experts in maintaining our attention, is the force that they have. The force that we need to develop is the force to say no. And from the addiction perspective, it is pleasurable whether people are addicted to pornography, increasingly addicted to gambling online, all the kinds of things that are exciting and pleasurable in real life have found their way onto the screen. And the release of dopamine insists on continuing that behavior, and it can be utterly devastating. As you and I know from clinical material, it devastates people's lives. So much like addiction to heroin, it's put the needle, i.e. screen, away. And for alcoholics, don't have it around right next to your hand. When you go to sleep, put the phone in another room, or at least across the room. That doesn't have to be on the nightstand. The standard advice I give to people is when they say, but I use my phone for alarm, go to Target, buy a really cheap alarm clock, put it on your nightstand. It is not complicated. I listen to music when I go to sleep. Get a CD player, turn on the radio. There are solutions that combat what has been a concerted effort by the industry to bind us to the screen for everything. And the examples are alarm clock. Now we use the phones. Music, we use the phones. Reservation for a restaurant, we use the phone. Buying shoe shine, we use the phone. Buying toothpaste, we use the phone. It's becoming increasingly impossible to do things because we have to use the phone. My favorite example was a feeble attempt to give up Amazon. And for a week, I was successful and then actually needed shoe shine paste. And driving around Philadelphia, couldn't find it at all. And so I give up. Went back on Amazon. It was on my doorstep next day. And such is life. We have boxes and boxes of Amazon coming every day.
Yes, and that's sort of the way it is today. But in terms of watching screens, I think we can do something about that. And children, in a way, that they may try to slip and slide away from the rules of parents and sneak phones, and they do that. At least there's somebody to set the rules. But with adults, we have to set these rules ourselves. What kind of things can people do? I mean, they're always the standard things. Eat well, exercise. You can exercise instead of being on screens. It's wonderful advice if people follow it. But what other things can people do instead of watching screens? I mean, whether they have an Amazon account or not.
Well, you ask yourself, what am I getting out of this versus what am I giving it? And the valuation of time then becomes a really important counterbalance to this is pleasurable and fun. Depending on the age, the kind of engagement varies of what people focus on. The biggest problem is the shared experience, in the sense that if you're not participating in Instagram, I'll use that as an example, you're sort of left out because everybody else is on Instagram as well. So because we're highly social beings, we see that as the version of intimacy. And we go right back to the beginning of our conversation. This is a quasi-intimacy. It is not really a shared experience, because we also, whatever celebrity couple is doing whatever. One of the examples of Dr. Gill living under a rock was when I asked, who is Kim Kardashian and what does she do? And I finally found out she does nothing. She's just a celebrity and personality. And it was a fascinating response how popular somebody that effectively does nothing really is in this world. But it's, again, that sort of ability of community to create reality and a belief that this person is somebody that we should care about and follow in great detail. So really, the process of how do we interact with screens is a process of asking yourself, do I really need to spend this time on this screen right now? What am I getting out of it? And do I need this? Or would I be better off planning my dinner and chopping vegetables? So it's a very mechanical process, and the meta-awareness of time is important. Big believer, I've probably said in every podcast, in analog clocks with big old arms telling you what time is, and look at it every so often and you'll see how much time is spent on a screen.
Yeah. I think the other thing that's crucially important, we all need people, whether it's a partner with whom we can connect with, or whether it's any portion of a community. So I think in-person connection, it could be on the phone if you have conversations with friends, but people versus things and objects. Talking to a person, as we're talking now, it is through a screen, but I'm not in Philadelphia and you're not in Maryland or DC. But you can have intimate exchanges with people on screens, people you already know, not strangers. But I would say community versus, and it can be community with one, like the couple who has community time. Maybe they're reading a book. Sometimes they read them together, but being together, talking, that's something, that's a novel thing, talking with a friend.
A very important point. I was paying attention to the energized debate about the CEO of Chase Manhattan Bank insisting that people come back to office. And he was actually speaking very directly to this age segment that we're discussing today, and the failure of developing really important career-affecting communication skills and ability to, through interaction, discover what somebody's skill set is, begin to evolve your career, Again, to me, very important skill is how to tolerate aggression, how to deal with creative dialogue. And you really, I happen to agree with. I mean, you can't get that in a Zoom meeting. It's just not possible. So beyond all of the productivity discussion, I have thoughts about it, but that's neither here nor there. Or the discussions of it's a pain in the nose to drive and expense and blah blah. That all stands firm. I agree with all of the objections, but the dramatic loss of ability to grow and develop your brain is a good argument to ask everybody to go back to the office. In fact, I know young people personally that have, without therapy, without any intervention from outside, recognized it themselves. Friends, children, and I had these conversations with them. They, on their own, decided that they need to go to the office. Young professionals that I see, I chase them into the office as much as I possibly can. Invariably, all of them will say it was a good idea. Eventually, once we get through all of the obstacles and time. One of the objections that young professionals will raise, well, it takes me an hour to get to work. And neuroscience responds to that. That is an hour that is time open to you to meditate about your life, your choices, your workplace, your love, your future. It's an hour of time. If you fill it with a screen, if you're sitting at home, you're not going to do any of those things. And we're back to time is precious, and each developmental step requires that time and concerted effort. Screen is a necessary enemy of all of the above.
Yes, I agree with most of what you said. I've just had a little informal survey I've done with myself since COVID, and I think that extroverts are usually dying to get back to the office. They can't wait. They couldn't stand it during COVID being home, and they can't stand it now. People who are more introverted are okay with some work at home. And if it's some, I think that's okay. Just so they're not just staying on screens all the time, just so they have some social time, just so they go sometimes and meet with their colleagues. I mean,
And there is really speaking to the development of the brain issue. There is a delta between people like you and me that have experienced all of that social interacting and in-person interacting and have the skills in place because we have developed them. So the choice becomes sort of then a mechanical convenience, whatever choice. But what I was reacting to was the development of the brain that because of COVID was isolated and then just continued to never be exposed to the tension of the workplace where, let's say 50% of people are Republicans and 50% of people are Democrats. Let's have a vigorous conversation in person versus total I'm not talking. So that then truly from the development perspective, I think this generation is missing a lot of that in-person skills training.
now, speaking of Republicans and Democrats speaking together, there is a group, we've probably talked about it. I've been to a couple of their events, Braver Angels. It was started by a family therapist, Bill Dougherty. I think there was a co-founder too. But they actually bring people together from blue states and red states. I think now it's in person again. It was in person, then people were forced to do it during COVID via Zoom, but I think they're back together again. But they actually have civil conversations between Democrats and Republicans. And the idea is not to be disrespectful in any way, but just to talk about ideas. And it's been amazing in the ones that I participated in, how close people actually are. I'm not talking about the people on the far left or the far right, but people who are, well, red state, blue state, but in the middle range. People are not that far off on too many things.
Back to the development, it is so much more difficult to be enraged with a real human being that's right in front of you and you're looking them in the eye than shooting an enraged TikTok response or Twitter response to somebody that is not looking at you. Or there's a real person and you can't block them. They're just there. You can't cancel them from your life. You have to negotiate a conversation. And early 20s are the time when you learn how to have those conversations. So some of the interesting developmental outcomes is the growth of 30-year-olds that have grossly delayed development, and 30-year-olds that don't have relationships. They live in quasi-communes because they are not ready to be an intimate couple. And usually they have a pet or two because it's an object of love and replacement for intimacy. So there are societal impacts that are emerging from failure to negotiate this developmental step, intimacy versus loneliness.
So if we have well, we do have a chance. I'm going to create a chance for a wrap up here. Why don't we each think of something? I have something in mind. I don't want it to slip my mind. So, well, I'll start it then.
Go first, yes.
I think at any age, and what we're talking about adulthood specifically, that community is so important. And community can be with one person, but this is in lieu of screens. Putting screens aside, connecting with people or a person is vitally important. The other thing that's important is doing things one loves to do. If it's painting and you always wanted to do it and have never done it before, you can learn to paint. Now, you might need a screen if you're looking for a lesson and you're not going to a literal lesson, but it's great to go to some of those paint and sip. So I don't know if you've ever done that, but a lot of people are there. There's a teacher. I'd like to do it with friends and family members, and just have water, have wine, have anything you want, and paint with people. It's so interesting what people come up with. So that's a community activity, and you're learning a little something along the way. Could be playing a musical instrument, something for the self without screens, and then something with people. I think that's a good combo.
Creating habits and strengthening the pathways that allow us to engage life at its fullest really begin in this stage of development. So ability to feel competent enough to go to a local bar, strike up a conversation, and just see what happens. As you said, something creative, something new, something you didn't expect, something you didn't plan for can happen. And it both develops your brain, but it also develops a sense of capacity, a sense of resilience, that there's an obstacle that gets overcome. The predictable pathway of, I'm interested in a particular thing, and you find it on the screen, and you spend 3 hours doing it, does not grow any particular function. So the functionality of really experiencing the richness of life, including smells and tastes and touch and communication, and the beauty of it all is really missed if we're interacting with a piece of glass and metal.
Well, I said that you would finish it up. Maybe we can combine something here, because you said the word habit, and it made me think of how often people say to me, but I want to exercise, but how do I form that habit of doing it? I started to do it, especially at the beginning of the year. I make all these resolutions, and then I notice I just drop off. I don't go to the gym anymore. From personal experience, I know you have to do it. You have to make yourself at the beginning, and then it becomes something you just do, like brushing your teeth. So I have this little weight area, and I bought this equipment during COVID. And when I walk by now, so it has to do with lifting weights. When I walk by the area, I think, oh, got to go in and lift my weights. And it's not painful. It's not difficult anymore, because it's just what I do when I'm walking to this office. It was painful. I didn't want to do it. I used to argue with myself, say, you do it later, or you did it yesterday. Your muscles are supposed to rest. But I walk by that area now, and it's not difficult. But there are so many days or weeks, supposedly, that it takes to form a habit. You just need to make yourself do it.
And I think that's a great topic, if I may, with my reaction to it. Like we do exist in a dialectic of pleasurable and displeasurable. And a lot of things that are good for us are displeasurable, much like Eating McDonald's all the time may be pleasurable to some people. Eventually, it'll kill you if you don't eat a vegetable. The same thing with exercise. It is arguably displeasurable. I don't understand people that wake up at 5 a.m. and go for a run. That's a great thing for them, not for me. Thank you. But it's displeasurable and necessary. And the replacement for it, the screen or the TV or something, is pleasurable, and it's a waste of time. And the sooner we learn that and learn how to manage, like, this is what I need to do, it's sort of interesting to talk to young adults in therapy. And the frequent theme with young adults is, I don't feel motivated. And then I actually do a little neuroscience lecture, which is as human beings, we're highly motivated to eat, sleep, and have sex. Highly motivated. Everything else is sort of pain in the nose. So jokingly, I tell them I don't believe in the word motivation in this particular context. This is something you just do. As you said, you walk by and you lift your weights. Don't have to be motivated to do it. And similarly, the notion of the word deserve is very complicated.
Yeah.
And the young adults in particular have been acculturated, I believe, through the screen, the notion of what they deserve as part of that stage of development versus these are the things that I need to do in order to hopefully obtain what I would like or what I think I need. So it's interesting to play with words with young adults and take them apart.
One more thing. Brain rot. Let's make it clear what we're talking about, because we know what we're talking about, but it's not a commonly used word yet, although it's gaining in popularity, or it wouldn't have won the 2024 Oxford Award for the Word of the Year. But we're really talking about atrophy of the brain, for one thing, and atrophy of one's social existence if a person is just tuned into screens all the time.
There was an interesting study, and I can't quote it off the top of my head, that in later adulthood, and we'll get there, watching daytime TV will rot your brain, quite literally, because functions will atrophy if you spend hours watching daytime television. This is before the phones. So we could say equivalently, as much as people think if they're reading a newspaper or something on the phone, it's not rotting their brain. We're social creatures, and the brain wiring really depends on social interaction. So from that perspective, yep, it's a brain rot.
Connect with people.
Yeah. And
Okay.
We'll connect soon.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, bye for now.